Hi, I'm Michelle Gussow, and today I'm chatting with author George Kramer. So, what I want is, I've got to tell people that the first time I met you was at one of your book signings, and you had a little tag on that said, famous author George Kramer. So what made you come up with that idea?
Well, you got to set yourself apart from people. I was with other authors that write the same genre. Of course, it's going to be different stories, it's going to be different plots, but you need not necessarily a branding, but you need something to set yourself apart, because I knew the shock value, because I like to do things shock value to see reactions.
Right, so just like, people would definitely want to come up and famous. Do I know you?
Oh, I've
like
seen,
that.
yeah. There's been authors on the other side of the convention where I was at, and they'll say, "Hi, famous author," so it works.
It works very well, yeah. So what I was just wondering there is, how long have you been writing?
Well, on and off since 5th grade. I grew up in New York, and in 5th grade there was a teacher that read Treasure Island out loud with the pirate accent. Everybody I talked to from my high school loved it, cherished the memories. I was bored, and this was pre-computer, so I started writing. And then I progressed to short stories, poems, and then plays, because I loved MASH, the original MASH.
Okay.
So I wrote one science fiction book, another book. Well, it was 48 pages, but for like a 13, 14-year-old, that's a novel.
Absolutely. No, I was remembering I was actually influenced an awful lot too. My 4th grade teacher used to read stories out loud, and she did different voices for all the characters.
That's interesting.
And actually that influenced me a lot, because it made me think I want to have characters that are interesting enough to want to change the voices. So,
yeah.
Absolutely. So, the particular genre, let everybody know what you write.
I'm a multi-genre author. I started off with fantasy. See, there's a big difference between, in my opinion, science fiction and science fantasy. Science fiction is if you have a spacecraft, you have to explain what type of propulsion system, where you're going, what type of planet, and all that. Fantasy, you can write about dinosaurs that shoot out purple-colored trees, and as long as it's relative to the storyline, it's fine. So I wrote fantasy, I've written poetry, medical horror. I just finished a murder mystery, and a book based on conversations with my daughter from age 5 to 13. Some of them were profound, hilarious, and I started posting them on Facebook, and I got kind of a following. And at 13 they said, "You need to compile a book of this. Take the funniest stuff." So I did, and I stopped at 13 because something happened at 13. She now goes in a room, closes the door, locks it, and watches YouTube videos.
Well, so obviously your daughter was an influence for that. What influenced some of your other writing?
Well, poetry is, I started initially out in poetry because I found it very good for the soul, but I came to the point where I was able to go through the dictionary, arbitrarily pick words, combine those words, and make a poem, and it made sense based on those diverse words. I just did it as an experiment, and I was able to do it. And then after that, I wrote short stories, but the fantasy, the first book of Arcadius, I had never even read fantasy prior to that. And then on Netflix they had the Dresden Files. It was based on by Jim Butcher, based on a sorcerer that lived in Chicago that worked with the police department. The only thing I didn't like is his staff in the show was a hockey stick. Yeah, okay. But I saw that it was based on books. So I read them, and I said, I can do that. I can do that, but I just don't know what. And that's when, that's how my mind works. I kept it in the background of my mind and visited my sister's house, and she was painting, and she had different colored paint, and she told me about primary and secondary colors. And that's the way my mind worked. It snapped up. That's what Arcadius is about, different color powers of sorcery.
Oh, and that actually was a very popular book, the first one, because we've talked about that. And you just finished the 8th one in that series?
Yeah, I just sent it to the editor. But the interesting thing about book 8 that I tried is I ended the series. However, I did an alternate ending where the storyline kept flowing, and I want this interactive, so I'll have the audience, I'll create a poll on social media. Do you want Arcadius to continue? Do you want it to stop? Either way I'm fine, because I have plenty of things to write about. And we'll see. I'll keep up for a few months after the book gets out, and whichever the readers want. Because I have an overactive imagination, I can continue Arcadius till I'm 90.
And there will be people who want you to do that, absolutely. They'll be looking forward to that, I think. Just because I think at the one book signing,
Yeah.
people came up and I have to have the next one. When are you writing the next one? So that was...
The cultivation of any author, in my opinion, especially fiction, well, it can include nonfiction, is to take your works and make it into a movie. In particular, Arcadius would be an awesome animation movie. Could you imagine those color magic shooting around, and when a yellow power meets a blue power and then green trickles down? I think it'd be awesome.
There's a lot of people who do that, so that's not a bad idea, as they say in film working.
Yeah.
So you have the horror.
Medical horror.
The medical horror, and that was, you said, based on something at the hospital.
What I used to do, actually, before I worked at the hospital, I used to do recoveries at the hospital, so I knew a few of the people. But I have to differentiate between horror and medical horror, because I took medical facts and built a fiction story, so I call it faction. When people, like on a license, when you have a heart, that's organ donation. When people pass on, some of those organs become tissue, specifically the heart and the skin. So for many years I surgically removed body parts from people that were dead for donation to enhance people's lives. I was very proud of that. But the old adage in writing is write what you know. Mm-hmm. So I decided to include a couple of friends of mine to make the book cover, and I created a serial killer psychologically abducting people and explaining how to take body parts, basically. If you want to know how to take the heart, skin, bone, tendons, read the book. Book 2, I know, right? Book 2, people said it's more of a storyline, that they like it just a little better. But there were people that surprised me, come up, they asked me what this book about. I said, look, it's medical horror, it's graphic. Are you 18 years old? You know, got to make sure. And one timid girl said, yeah, I like it. And I like it. I was like, okay. She ended up emailing me, telling me how much she loved it and wanting the second book when it came out. So I emailed her and met her at a book signing, and she bought the second one. So you just never know who reads what.
Now, is that something you're going to continue, that medical horror series?
Yes, because before the first one came out, I asked at work, because I work in a large surgery department, and I asked on social media, does anybody want to be killed off of my books? I said it as a joke, but I got like 80 responses. So I picked several people, but there was 2 conditions. 1, I had to use their real name. Not necessarily the occupation, but their real name. And 2, you will die horrifically.
So give me an example of one of the horrific deaths.
Okay, so Ben, who is the serial killer, he has a hood. Okay, he was born with a mustard discoloration all across his left side of his body. Consequently, he got made fun of, he got bullied, and his hatred for humanity cemented via that. So one day he was at the ER, the ED department, with his mom, who he loathed, but it's his mom, and he saw people coming in with scrubs on, with biohazard boxes and all that, and he went up to them and asked them, and it was about tissue procurement. So he faked his credentials and got a job, but he was at the mall, and he did not like people seeing his face, so he put a hood on, a hoodie, and he was sitting all the way back, and I modeled it after the mall out here, and He was sitting all the way in the back, and someone sat next to him. Said, and he ignored her. She started talking to him, and it's basically a narration on his perspective. It's actually a journal based. It's not chapter based, and he's saying, "You need to get out of here. You need to get out of here," to that girl, but she followed him. So he ended up in the woods with her, and that was his second victim. His first, he found out where his father lived, and he just wanted to practice on him. It's graphic,
Yeah.
but it's medically accurate, and it's cool. You know, there are some people, sorry, there are some people that emailed me, particularly one of my sisters, and said, "George, I just cannot read this book before I go to bed." and then I email back or tell people, whatever the case may be, I was like, then I did my job.
Scared him to death.
Well, you know, in each genre, you got to go 100%. So with fantasy, I go 100%. With medical horror, I go 100%. Poetry was the same way. I just go into a trance, and there are times I write and like 3 or 4 hours have elapsed and I had no idea. It was like 5 minutes to me.
That's lucky, in a way that you can get so focused and do it. I think I'm in groups with a lot of other writers, and we have those moments like we could sit there and nothing comes.
Really?
Absolutely. I'm telling you, I'm even with something simple for me, like the recipe books I do. It's like the recipe's sitting right here. I can't seem to get it into the text file.
Well, that's interesting, because something similar happened to a friend at work. He said, "You know, George, I used to write in college." I said, "Well, bring your stuff, I'll read it." And I read it and I was like, this is like a narration, this is not fiction. He goes, "Well, I can never come up with ideas." I was like, "Really?" He's like, "So, pretend you're in the classroom. The clock starts going backwards. Why? The teacher in that classroom has yellow chalk, turns red when you write. Why? Guy next to you in the classroom suddenly vibrates and disappears. Why?" I mean, how can you not? I'm sorry, this is me.
Right.
The way my brain works. How can you not come up with ideas?
No, I'm just saying that's just a wonderful thing to have, and I understand a lot of times I get idea after idea, and part of it comes down on the paper, and then it's like, I'm like, now what?
Well, now what you do is you brainstorm.
Yeah,
You
right.
brainstorm. I have like 4 or 5 people at work. I would just go up to them, "Hey, I got a problem with Arcadius. I'm in this kind of situation. What do you think I should do?" And they've all read the books.
Right.
And they're like, "Well, you need to do this," or, "George, I don't know. Maybe you could do this." And from that, usually I'll garnish a nugget, and then that nugget turns into a whole scene.
So what advice would you give people who are interested in writing, or think they can write, or can write and aren't, or...
Well, it's interesting, because there's a guy that I used to work with, and he would write, and then he wants to be a writer. I was like, "Well, send me your stuff." So I read it, and I was like, "Well, you have no punctuation, dude. There's no punctuations, no paragraphs." I said, "You know what, for the first few pages, I'm not an editor, but I'll fix it for you." He loved it. And then next time I saw him, "Hey, did you write anything?" "No." A few days later, "Did you write anything?" This is advice for emerging writers. "Did you write anything?" "No." Next time I saw him, I go, "I got a piece of advice for you." He goes, "What?" I said, "It'll help you." "What?" "Just write the damn thing. Just sit down and write." Simple, yet profound. Probably because I've been in moods where I didn't want to write, but I've never ever had writer's block. Because when I sit down and write, I write. I don't know. Maybe it's... I don't know. We grew up differently. My mom and all of us used to sit down and converse, talk. There was very little TV. So ideas were exchanged. I don't know. Maybe it's our upbringing why we think differently.
So, aside from, like, when you talk about the medical reality in like the horror, and what other aspects like come out of the real life and make it into the horror and the fantasy, and I think you said you had a murder mystery.
Okay, very good point, because I remember one time what's called a healer scan in my Arcadius books is where, do you remember Star Trek where they had that thing where you sat down and the thing would go back and forth? Well, I was watching a Star Trek episode and I was like, you know what, I can do something similar to that in Arcadius book, except if you're a yellow powered sorcerer, it emits yellow beams where it'll replenish your energy, or if you're hurt, it's actually in the infirmary. So I got that from a Star Trek episode. There was a medical piece that just happened to be on the table, and I was writing a fighting scene on Arcadius, so I was like, I can modify that to the scene I'm writing right now. So I could take an object in any room and probably find a place for it in my book.
Make it work for the fantasy.
I could do it in medical.
Medical.
To some it's just a rose, the murder mystery. I did colors for the fantasy, and I was like, how can I branch out colors in a different book, being totally different than fantasy, make it murder mystery? Came up with different colored roses.
So I don't know as much about the murder mystery book. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Sure, there's an eccentric, wealthy woman, she's probably about 30, Nancy Hemingway, that receives roses at her workplace, and she thought it was from her boyfriend. It's, can't remember what it was, peach or something, but each color roses represents something. And I did research on that. So she thought it was her boyfriend, so she went home, thanked him, and he's like, I didn't give you any roses.
No.
So she keeps getting these roses, and finally it's like in her bedroom on the nightstand, there's roses, and each one has poems relative to what's going to happen. Before this chapter begins, I found a couple of poems online that was relative to the storyline that was coming up. I also created poems for the storylines, and it came to a culmination of a stalker that was actually had up in the attic. He was watching her. And that's where he started writing all the poems.
It's another one you don't want to read before you go to bed.
Right. Well, and she has a cousin that helps her, Etna. I love that name. I was driving up to Huntington, Indiana for a book signing, and I kept seeing signs for Etna Lane closed, and that name just resonated with me, Etna. It's like Helen or Gertrude or something. So I incorporated that into my book because I saw that.
Another murder mystery in the works by any chance?
Yes. This is very interesting. So last year, my wife has a cousin down in Greensburg, Indiana, southeast. And we were going to take pictures of my daughter, Karis. So we were in the Greensburg Park, and my wife's cousin says, let's go to the railroad tracks. I take some pictures there. Okay. So while they're all setting up, taking pictures, I'm walking around, kicking the grass, leaves, and my wife said to me, what are you doing? I said, you never know what treasures you'll find. I found a meat cleaver, and it was so old the wood had decayed.
Oh my gosh.
So what is a meat cleaver doing near railroad tracks in a small town in Indiana? So this one is going to do a little more research. My father-in-law and I are going to drag my daughter down to Greensburg, do some, because I was just going to do a horror. My father-in-law said, no, let's weave some historical data into it. So I'm going to go to the police department and other places and see if there's any unsolved murders. If not, I'll make one up.
Yeah, I mean, that actually just screams to be written, doesn't it? It's just absolutely.
Yeah, I started picking it up and putting it towards the fan, and my wife goes, you're not bringing that home. I said, oh, yes, I am.
Totally, yeah.
So.
No, that one was just waiting there for you, I think. That just absolutely.
And then after that, people I worked with said, am I going to die in your book yet? Am I going to die in your book? So I may do Blind to Blood 3.
Now, how many people do you actually have left who you haven't killed in a book who are waiting
Lots.
I mean, literally. I mean that, and I saw where you had posted asking that, but I didn't get to see like how many people had responded. So
Well,
that's really interesting.
Not only did people respond via social media, but I got emails, I got in person. And the second book of Blind to Blood, some woman that was in Texas that I'm friends with, she goes, that was marketing genius by putting everybody's picture on the front and back cover. I was like, why? I said, I just pictured it as a book cover.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And she said, well, everybody that's on that cover will now market your book. I didn't even think of that.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely genius.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it'll keep up. And I think, too, anybody who's getting killed off in any of your books, hey, I'm getting killed off in the next book, make sure to see me.
Yeah, we discussed that in surgery. I'll go to someone, you can't speak to him, I killed him off in a book, he's just an apparition.
I love that. It's absolutely hysterical. So, where can people find your books?
On Amazon, currently I created my own company. I'm going to do a website. It'll be on there eventually. But Amazon.com/author/George Kramer. Or you can go to my Facebook page, ArcadiusTheSorcerer.com, via Facebook.
Okay, and probably look for you at book signings everywhere.
Yes, I'm trying to do a balance. Last year and the year before I did many book signings and trying to balance family life, but I am at some big ones like the Christmas and Hobby Show in November. There's a festival in Greenfield for 4 days. I go there, do well. And there's a science fiction, science fantasy over on Shadland 21st in conjunction. I go every year.
Yeah, we've done that one.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, it is so nice to have you visit with me.
Appreciate it.
And sorry, we wish we had more time. Maybe we'll get you back here. But I want to thank you for watching and join me next time on the couch.
Thanks.